Hello everyone, Josh Teekman here with Land O'Lakes and welcome to Cheese 101. I want to thank you for attending this seminar today and I'm really excited to be here. We're going to try to have some fun learning about cheese. So if you have any questions and the chat box is available, please just type in your questions and we'll be answering them throughout the presentation. All right. So with that being said, let's just jump right in. Now, I love this presentation because I love cheese. I've always worked with cheese, of course, but as I started learning about different cheeses throughout my career, I realized that there's a lot more to cheese than I thought. There's a ton of history and information about cheese, and different cheeses can vary drastically. The complexity of cheese can vary more than wine at times, and the vast amount someone can learn about cheese is truly astonishing. So that being said, I am not a cheese expert by any means. We will cover some of the history of cheese, but we'll be talking mostly on readily available cheeses. We'll discuss how they are made and talk about their different characteristics. And towards the end, I will show you how you can make your own cheese at home. Now, it sounds kind of complicated, but it can be very easy depending on the type of cheese you want to make. So no worries there. Let's first break down the different categories of cheese, okay? Now we're gonna be talking about 7 different categories of cheese, but it's worth knowing that some cheeses can belong to different categories, okay? Now the first category is fresh cheeses. Now these are unaged cheeses and they do not have a rind. Now a rind is basically the cheese skin or outer shell, but these cheeses are very moist, soft with a really creamy and mild texture and a mild taste. So examples of some fresh cheeses include many goat cheeses, mozzarella, feta, ricotta, and queso fresco. The next category is semi-soft cheeses. Now these cheeses are known for melting. They are great for grilled cheese sandwiches, fondues, and any other recipes that require melting of the cheese. They have a very thin rind and they're very kind of springy to the touch, okay? Now, they can range from mild flavors all the way to pungent flavors because they can also belong to another categories in this list, such as bloomy rinds, wash rinds, or blue cheese, which we'll be talking about here later on. Now, some examples of semi-soft cheeses are things like young Goudas, most blue cheeses, and American cheese. Now, Land O'Lakes extra melt cheeses, for example, is a type of this cheese. We actually take another step further. We take special care in the cheese making process that allows the extra melt product to really melt even more evenly, and it gets even more creamy than a typical American cheese. In fact, all of our cheeses and cheese sauces are made to melt and hold exceptionally well. Now, we also have cheeses in other categories as well. Third category we're going to talk about today are the bloomy rind category. Now, you know these cheeses by their white, almost fuzzy rinds to them, okay? They have very creamy insides, and the rind is formed on these cheeses by exposing cheese to mold spores, which break down the protein and the fats in the cheese to make it really kind of soft and delicious cheese. Brie and Camembert are examples of this bloomy rinds category. Now you can see in this brie here, it has a very soft white rind. Now we'll be talking about this a little later on, okay? Moving on to the semi-hard category. Now these cheeses include cheddar cheese, Gouda, and aged sheet melt cheeses. These cheeses are made by pressing curds into molds and aging them for several months. They can have a natural rind to them, a waxed or cloth rind. We'll talk about those. And they can have a wide range of textures from semi-firm to very firm. Now, semi-hard cheeses have less moisture than semi-soft cheeses. Less moisture means a firmer cheese, okay? The fifth category are the hard cheeses. Now, these are the firmest cheeses, and they're generally the most complex. They are aged anywhere from several months to several years. They generally have grainy textures and like a salty, nutty flavor to them. Some have an elastic texture when melted, such as a Gruyere. Other hard cheeses suitable for grating, for example, such as Asiago or Parmigiano. Then from there you have the washed rind cheese categories. You know these cheeses when you smell them, right? These are the cheeses that people say are extremely stinky. I've had the opportunity to smell some of these cheeses in France, and if you're not used to them, some of them can really knock your socks off. But just because they have strong aromas doesn't mean they all taste that way. Many of these cheeses are very mild in tasting. But these cheeses are made, these rinds are made by being washed repeatedly with a salty brine or with wine or beer or brandy or any other interesting liquid during the ripening. Now, as the cheese ripens with these liquids being coated and sprayed on, it encourages the growth of bacteria, which lends to the pungent aromas. Some of these cheeses include Stinking Bishop, which is a suitable name, and Taleggio, which I actually have here, and we will be talking about this a little later as well. Now, the last category is blue. Now, blue cheeses, of course, have a distinct blue or green streaks throughout the cheese, okay? Now, these streaks are created by adding any kind of number of different penicillium mold strains to the milk, and then piercing as the cheese ages so oxygen can be allowed in, and the oxygen is what the mold needs and it can now thrive. And that gives the cheese its unique flavor. Now, blue cheeses include Gorgonzola from Italy, Roquefort from France, Stilton from Britain, and Maytag from Iowa. And of course, there's many other types of blue cheeses available out there. Now, it's important to point out that most of all these cheeses in these categories all kind of start out basically made in the relatively the same way, okay? Now, little changes and techniques along the cheese making process will determine the final results on the cheese. For example, there are just really small tweaks in the making with making cheddar cheese versus, say, a Colby Jack cheese, but you do get a big difference by just making some little tweaks along the cheese making process. So now let's talk about milk used in cheese making. Now, I suppose you can probably make milk out of almost any mammal milk, but traditionally, traditional cheese is made from cow's milk, sheep's milk, goat's milk, and even water buffalo milk. Now, you might also be able to find cheeses made from yak's milk or camel milk, but typically it's those four cheeses, okay? Now, cow's milk is the most commonly used dairy in cheese production because it has a relatively high fat content at 3.25%, and the general abundance of cow's milk makes it an ideal dairy for making cheese. Thousands of cheeses are made using cow's milk, including cheddar, Munster, Swiss, Parmesan, Gouda, and of course, many more. Sheep's milk has an extremely high fat content compared to cow's milk. So sheep's milk has a 6.75% fat content. Now, because of the high fat content, it is less suitable for drinking, but it's ideal for cheese production. The high fat content means that more cheese can be made from a liter of sheep's milk when compared with a liter of cow's milk. Many European cheeses are made from sheep's milk, which include cheeses like feta, Roquefort, Manchego, Pecorino Romano, Ricotta, and certain blue cheeses as well. Now, goat's milk is pretty close to cow's milk in terms of overall fat content. Again, cow's milk contains about 3.25% fat, while goat's milk has 3.5%. However, goat's milk contains more fatty acids when compared to regular dairy. Now, this combination of fats and fatty acids is what really gives goat milk its characteristic tartiness flavor. Goat's milk is generally also easier to digest than cow's milk, making fresh goat cheese a really good all-natural substitute for those suffering from lactose intolerance. Now, probably the rarest milk type on this list is water buffalo. It is a highly prized milk and is used in few kinds of cheese. The milk of a water buffalo has an extremely high amount of fat content, almost 10%, which makes it ideal for certain semi-soft and soft cheeses. The most famous example of cheese made from this is an Italian buffalo mozzarella. And it's a fantastic cheese. And I know I'm saying some of these wrong, so I do apologize for that, for anybody that knows it. But this buffalo mozzarella is a fantastic product. Now, the type of milk used will, of course, determine the type of cheese you'll have. A mozzarella made with cow's milk is going to taste a lot different than mozzarella made from a water buffalo. Now, in addition to the type of milk used, a cheese's flavor is also affected by its territory, or terroir. Now, terroir is basically a French word that literally means territory, okay? But it's used to mean all the other environmental factors that go into giving cheese its specific taste. These environmental factors include like where the region of the country the animals live in, the local climate, the altitude, the soil composition, the types of grass the animals eat, and a lot more. All of these elements affect the flavor of the milk and therefore the ultimate flavor of the cheese. For example, the same animal grazing in different locations will produce different milk and in turn, different cheese. Now, we've all probably heard that wine can taste different depending on where the grapes are grown, what type of soil they're grown in, and the climate. The same grape grown in Italy that is grown in France can produce two completely different types of wines. Now, the same goes for cheese, which is really kind of crazy, right? So if you ever wondered why there's so many different types of cheese, terroir is one of the many reasons for these differences. Now, seasonality can also play a role in how a cheese is made. It goes back to territory, but cheese made from winter milk when the animal's eating hay is going to taste a lot different than one from an animal who's been grazing in pastures during the summer months. So to learn more about the different varieties of cheese, let's talk a little bit about how cheese is made. It's important to know that there are many, many different methods and styles of cheese making, and each technique or change in the cheese making process affects the type and flavor of the cheese. However, the basic technique of a lot of different cheeses involves about 7 steps, okay? And they can range anywhere from 30 minutes for some fresh cheeses like mozzarella, or several months or even years for hard cheeses. But they all kind of start out relatively the same way. Step 1, you of course need to start with your milk. Unhomogenized milk will give you the best results, but standard pasteurized milk will also work. You start by heating the milk, and the temperature will depend on the type of cheese you want to make. Different temperatures are used for different types of cheeses. Then from there, you're going to add your cultures to your milk. Now, cultures are bacteria strains that acidify the milk. Some say it ripens or even sours the milk. The cultures feed on lactose in the milk. And then it turns the lactose and converts it in them into lactic acid. Now this helps give cheese flavor, and it helps protect it from contamination as well. It also assists in helping breaking down the proteins in the milk. Now there are many different types of bacterial cultures used in cheese making, and each different type of bacteria results in different characteristics, which in turn makes different types of cheese. So you can think of bacteria culture used as the secret ingredient that helps shape the finished product. Now, again, different types of bacteria make different kinds of cheese. So for example, Swiss cheese, of course, has holes in it, right? This is because the type of bacteria culture used when making Swiss cheese breathes out carbon dioxide. And it's these gas bubbles that build up in the cheese which makes those holes. Now, sometimes a cheese is made without cultures, and instead it's made with using a type of food acid, such as citric acid, vinegar, or even lemon juice. Now, these acids will produce soft cheeses such as paneer, queso blanco, and mozzarella. Now, actually, the first cheese I've ever made was a paneer cheese using lemon juice for my acid, and it was super easy, and it's a great intro into cheese making. Paneer is a fresh cheese. It's common in India, made by curdling milk in fruit or vegetable acids, okay? In my case, I use lemon juice. It is unaged and unmelting cheese, which makes it good for frying and other recipes where you want it to hold its shape. And if you ever go to an Indian restaurant, you'll see paneer throughout their entire menu. Now, only soft cheeses can really be made this way, and more traditional aged cheeses needs the bacterial culture in it. But some cheeses can be made either way. For example, mozzarella can be made with bacterial cultures and can take several hours and even overnight for some cheeses to create the acid needed. But it can be made with citric acid in under an hour, sometimes even quicker than that. Now, I'll be using citric acid in the recipes I will be doing later today. Now, milk will naturally acidify over time with nothing added. Without cultures or anything else added to them. Now, we've all had this experience with soured milk, okay? The natural bacteria in milk will ripen slowly over time. But when we add cultures or acids to the milk, we are able to control how we want that milk to develop the flavors, depending on the type of cultures, depending on the type of acids. And we can control the breakdown a lot more precisely than just waiting for it to kind of age. So that's why we add the acids or the cultures to this, okay? Now, it's at this time where the cheesemakers will add any other additives for the specific types of cheese that they want. And there's a lot of different types that they can add to these. But some common additives that are added at this stage include things like annatto, which is what gives cheese this really yellow or orange color to it. Now, annatto adds nothing to the cheese except for color. I mean, it's important to know that. It has no flavor and it's purely aesthetic to it. Also, Lepidus powder, this breaks down fat molecules and gives cheese a really nice sharp taste over time as it ages. It really helps create that sharpness flavor. Some people will also add calcium chloride to the cheese at this point. This is really kind of added to cheeses to milks that may have been pasteurized or ultra pasteurized because what it does is it strengthens the milk proteins and it's able to help make curds, separate curds from whey. Step 2, adding the rennet. Now you want to add the rennet last because it's going to immediately start combining the milk together to start forming curds. It causes proteins in the milk to coagulate together into casein, and it starts separating the whey from the curds. This is when you're going to start seeing the action happen. Now, after the rennet is added, you want to kind of let it sit and hardly kind of touch it because you're going to start breaking the bonds the rennet is already forming in the milk. So what is rennet? Well, rennet is actually found in the stomach of calves. They have it in order to coagulate the milk that they're getting from their mothers. It's actually believed that early humans stumbled upon this by mistake because they used calf stomachs to store their milk around 8,000 years ago. And when they did this, they noticed that the cheese would coagulate much faster when they're stored this way. And they must have decided that these cheese curds tasted good, and this kind of marks the earliest form of cheese making. So cheese has been around for thousands and thousands of years. This actually worked out well for them because they were able to store the cheese a lot longer than they were able to store milk, and this of course helped with survival. Now, of course, animal rennet is still used today, but we now also have forms of rennet made from plants, which is what I'll actually be using today when we get to the cheese making portion of the seminar. Step 3, cutting. Now, once the curd sets some, they need to be sliced or cut. Now, this helps release more of the whey. The smaller you cut the curds, the more whey gets released. The more whey that is released, the harder or firmer your cheese will be. So take cheddar cheese, for example. The curds are cut and milled into smaller cuts, resulting in a firmer cheese. Compare that, say, to a softer cheese like Colby, which would cut the curds differently with making Colby versus cheddar. So therefore, how you cut the curds can give you different results. Larger curds, softer cheese. Smaller curds, harder cheese. And this can have, how you do that really plays into what your end product and your end cheese is going to be. Step 4 is stirring and cooking. Now you want to be very gentle with this step, as you just want to heat up the curd and let the curds naturally release more whey. How you do this depends on what type of cheese you're going to do, but while the curds are heated up, they continue to acidify and they become more resistant to pressure. You're able to play with them a little bit more. This is a very important step in cheese making, because you're wondering, like, is enough whey expelled? Is it cooked long enough? What is the acidity level of this cheese? This step will give your cheese a lot of its characteristics. Step 5, draining. Now you want to drain the whey from the curd. Depending on the type of cheese you are making, depends on how you drain the whey, just like everything else in the process, right? Gouda, for example, requires an initial pressing inside the whey before you drain it off. However, this step and all the steps previously mentioned are done sometimes with only slight differences, and it's what really makes each variety of cheese unique. Step 6 is pressing. Pressing also depends on the type of cheese you are making. Mozzarella, for example, is pulled, it's not pressed, but a lot of cheeses are pressed. Now, this step is basically placing your curds inside a mold and is adding pressure to squeeze out more whey. The more pressure, the harder and firmer the cheese will be, and will determine the final result. Cheddar, for example, is pressed harder than Pecorino or, say, Colby Jack, which is a softer interior than cheddar has. The more pressure, the more whey release, the harder the cheese will be at the end result. And finally, step 7, air dried and aged. Now, most cheeses are air dried for 2 to 3 days before they can start to age. You want to get all that moisture off the surfaces of the cheese to prevent unwanted mold. After they are dried, then starts the aging process. And as a cheese ages and matures is when the complex flavors really start to develop. Now, these flavors vary depending on the type of bacteria culture used at the beginning of the process. Each bacteria culture has its own unique characteristics. And as those bacteria mature, so do their flavors, okay? Now, humidity and temperature also play a really important role in different varietals of cheeses. Now, blue cheeses, for example, are done a little bit differently, okay? The cheese maker will actually add penicillium mold to the beginning of the process along with the bacteria cultures. Yes, they add mold to the cheese as it's being made. And these blue or green veins in the blue cheese are that type of mold. Now, there are basically 2 types of this penicillium molds commonly used, and one of them is Penicillium roqueforti, originally discovered in the caves near Roquefort, France, giving the name to Roquefort cheese, which is a very popular type of blue cheese as well. Now, some blue cheese are not pressed at all, and this is because they want to allow the more air into the cheese for the mold to grow. As you can see here with this Stilton blue cheese, it had air pockets in here, which allows those mold bacteria to grow, okay? And some blues, after about 6 weeks, holes are punched into the cheese to allow even more airflow to really give the blues their characteristic veins. You can see here with this nice blue here, actually streaks where maybe that needle came in and allowed for more air, and that is where the mold started to grow. And again, fantastic products, and these really give a really nice characteristic to these cheeses. Okay, I know we have covered a lot so far, but before we get into making some fresh cheeses, let's talk a little bit about the rind, okay? Now, again, the rind on the cheese is basically a protective cover or skin surrounding the cheese. The rind helps retain moisture and to help protect the cheese. They can also impart a lot of different flavors depending on the type of rind into the cheese and really gives it its final characteristics. Now, there's a lot of different rinds a cheese can have. They can be simple, like wax surrounding. For example, on this cheddar has a nice black wax around it, or this Gouda here, you can kind of see the wax just kind of over this. And these cheeses are just simply dipped in wax before the aging process starts. But rinds can also be very complex as well in their own rights. Now, a natural rind is one that occurs along with the aging process, okay? So take Parmesan, for example. This outer layer of this cheese it starts to harden and starts to make its own rind. You can kind of see the difference in this as the rind, as it ages, it gets dry and hard, and it kind of separates, and now it's protecting the complete inside of this here. These rinds on some of these can be very hard, or other natural rinds such as this one here, you can kind of see how it's protecting the inside of the cheese here, can be a little more soft, okay? Now, these natural rinds give a lot of flavor into the final cheese product. Now, these rinds are safe to eat. Both of these all natural rinds are safe to eat, but it's a lot of times there's an acquired taste, right? And this hard rind here for this, a lot of people aren't a fan of the hard rind by itself, but it can be grated into recipes and it gives a really good, nice flavor to this. Or they can just be frozen and saved and throw them in by chunks into recipes, and it kind of melts down and it gives your dish a really fantastic flavor. Now, bloomy rinds. These are the rinds that are white and almost fuzzy looking, right? Like we mentioned earlier, Brie's a really good example of a bloomy rind. These are soft rinds that are almost fuzzy to the touch, right? And these are made by introducing mold spores to the surface of the cheese. Now, this breaks down the protein and the fats in the cheese, and it makes for a very soft and delicious rind, and also makes it so that the inside can be nice and soft and creamy, and also very delicious. Other examples of bloomy rinds are Camembert and Humboldt Fog. Now, these rinds are also safe to eat if you'd like to, but it can be an acquired taste. So you don't need to feel guilty if you want to cut them off, but they can add a lot of nice flavor to the experience. Now, washed rinds. Now, washed rinds are rinds formed by spraying or coating liquid brine onto the cheese surface while it ages. Now, the liquid can be anything from a salty brine, beer, brandy, wine, or any other liquid that the cheesemaker wants to use, really. And this is usually done throughout the aging process. Now, the liquid produces a flavor imparting bacterium mold all over the surface of the cheese, forming the rind. And the wet, dark surface this cheese is in, it makes it ideal for these molds to grow, okay? Now, this process is what gives cheese a very strong, stinky odor. These are the reasons for the stinky cheeses, is these washed rind cheeses. These are the stinky cheeses you hear about. In fact, the bacterium created from this method is actually related to the bacterium produced on, say, a person's foot after a while in dark, humid conditions, which is why some people say that this stinky cheese sometimes smells like stinky feet. Now, these rinds, of course, are an acquired taste, but don't let these cheeses scare you off. These cheeses don't taste like they smell, and oftentimes really a nice, mild flavor to these things. No, don't get me wrong, the smell of these cheeses have a very strong odor to them, but they're really fantastic, delicious cheeses. So the way our body produces the aromas versus how we taste them are completely different. So don't be afraid of some of these cheeses, on these washed rind cheeses. Now, I know that there's a ton of information on cheese, and of course there's so much more to know and to learn about cheese. This is just really the tip of the iceberg, really. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about what we talked about, or anything else that interests you, really. And with that, let's finally get ready and start making some cheese. Okay, so let's start with mozzarella cheese. I have here a large stock pot, 1 gallon of cow's milk, whole cow's milk. We have a thermometer that can clip to the side, a chef's knife, a slotted spoon, glass bowl, rubber gloves, and here I have a 1/4 tab of vegetable rennet, and we're going to be dissolving that in water shortly. Have a 1.5 teaspoons of citric acid, and I have a teaspoon of sea salt that we're going to be used to season our cheese. So those are the ingredients, and what we're going to do is, like I said, we're going to dissolve the rennet and the citric acid in each a 1/4 cup of room temperature water. And you're going to want to make sure that these dissolve fully in and are mixed really well into the water. But every time we use the rennet or citric acid, we're going to be dissolving it in water first. Now, this mozzarella cheese uses both rennet and citric acid. And depending on the cheese you use, some may not use any of this, and some may use both, and some may just use the one. So again, make sure that you are make sure these are dissolved freely and put aside. All right, so we're going to start by adding our milk into the pot. So it's a cold pot, adding in our cold milk, and we're going to immediately be adding in the citric acid. So our citric acid mixture we made, we're going to add it in slowly, and we're going to kind of stir it in an up and down fashion, just to kind of really delicately. We don't want to over stir this, because when you add the citric acid, it's going to immediately start the curdling process. So this is the temperature, and where you add the citric acid depends on the cheese. But for mozzarella, we are starting with cold milk, adding the citric acid right away, and we're going to bring this up to 90 degrees. Okay, so be careful not to scorch the milk. Of course, you want to stir it, but be very gentle not to scorch it. And then once you get up to 90 degrees, you can kind of see it starts to separate and curdle a little bit already. After it gets up to 90 degrees, we're going to take it off the heat completely. I have this induction burner completely shut off at this point. And at this point is when I'm going to be adding the rennet mixture that we had. So this is going to be the culture that we're using for our mozzarella cheese. I'm going to stir it for about 2 to 3 seconds, make sure it's all the way in there. And from here, I'm just going to cover it and keep it off the heat. I'm going to put a towel over it just to kind of retain some of the heat. But this is off the heat, 90 degrees, added our rennet, and we're just going to let this sit for 20 minutes undisturbed. After 20 minutes, you can take your lid off and check it out. And you can see that it really has separated some now. With my chef's knife now, I'm going to be cutting this into cubes. Now for this mozzarella, I'm cutting it into 1-inch cubes, and we're going to be cutting them in a crisscross fashion. And as we cut this, more of that whey is going to start being released. Now once I cut the whey, I'm going to bring this back up to, turn the heat back on. I'm going to bring this up to 105 degrees, maybe very gently stirring it just a tad. What we're trying to do is we're trying to cook these curds just a little bit, and bringing it up to 105 degrees will get it to the texture and the firmness that we're looking for on the mozzarella. You can see it kind of changes here. Those curds sometimes get pretty small, but don't worry, this will all work in the end. After 105 degrees, I'm taking it back off the heat, and I'm going to be taking my slotted spoon, and I'm going to be taking out the curds from the whey. Now this could take a little while. Like I said, your curds could look a little different than this. They could look bigger, they can look smaller, but don't worry, this process should work out pretty well. As the whey sits, as the curd sits a little bit, I just kind of keep draining the whey off as I keep moving the curds around. So this is the curds from our milk, and from here I'm going to be putting this in the microwave for 1 minute. Now there is a method where you can heat this back up in the whey, but I find that the microwave just works really, really well. Now what you didn't see here that I accidentally missed on this step was I added the salt at this point. So I added the teaspoon of salt, and now I'm mixing that salt in. And you can kind of see this is starting to kind of work together, kind of apply together just a little bit as I'm working with it here. Now from here I'm going to put this back into the microwave for 30-second intervals. Now what I'm trying to do is get this up to 135 degrees, 30 seconds at a time. This took me 3 times at 30 seconds to temp it to make sure I was at that about that 135 degrees. Now once we get to that heat level, we can start working this a little bit. Now it was a little hot to touch, so I ended up starting this out with a spoon until it cooled down just a little bit. But then you just start working it. You start kind of pushing it together, kind of folding it. Drain the whey a little bit, and I'm continuing to work it here. Now this cooled down on me a little bit, and that's okay. If it cools down and it's not really coming together, I'm just gonna go ahead and put it back into the microwave for another 30 seconds, and then come out and it's nice and warm and I can start reworking it again. All right, right out of the oven, microwave again after about 20 seconds, and I'm gonna start working this, and now you can really kind of see this starting to come together nicely. Now I'm getting that sheen, that nice shininess to it. It's really pliable and very elastic, and this is exactly what we're looking for. Now from here, I'm just gonna go ahead and pull it. Now I'm gonna pull it about 3 to 4 times, and depending on how much you pull this and work with this, the firmer the cheese is gonna be. But again, I'm just doing it about 4 times, giving it a nice stretch, putting it together. Then from here, you're just gonna kind of work it around like you would dough, and you're just gonna kind of pinch off the edge, roll it into a nice ball, pinch off the edge, and there you go. A really nice, fresh mozzarella. And this tastes great on its own, but what I did was here, I put it in a bowl and I refrigerated it for an hour after it cooled. And you can see it's a really perfectly dense, sliced as I sliced this fresh mozzarella. This tastes great when it's warm, like I said, but after this works really well. You can store this for about 5 days in the refrigerator. Just make sure you cover it and work on it. So there's the fresh mozzarella cheese. Okay, queso blanco. Now queso blanco is Spanish for white cheese. It can be a mild creamy soft cheese. I'm making this as a nice crumbly cheese. Now this one we will be using our cheesecloth. We'll be using a cheese basket. You can use either actually. I'll be using the cheese basket for this, but you can use the cloth. We're gonna have 2 teaspoons of citric acid, 1 teaspoon of salt, our slotted spoon, thermometer, and a gallon of whole milk. Colander and our pot. Now you notice here that I am not using rennet. In this one, this recipe, I will not be using rennet. And I'll be putting the milk in, 1 gallon of whole milk. And for this recipe, we're actually gonna be heating the milk first, okay? So before we're adding our citric acid, we're gonna be heating the milk to 185 degrees. Now I'm prepping up my citric acid, got my citric acid in a 1/4 cup of water. I'm gonna make sure that that dissolves nicely. And I'm just gonna slowly heat up my milk. I'm gonna occasionally stir to make sure I'm not scorching it, but I wanna heat it up to 185 degrees. After 185 degrees, I'm gonna go ahead and add my citric acid very slowly at this point right here. I'm being careful to pour in slowly and stir in that up and down motion. And you can see the citric acid immediately starts breaking up the whey from the curds here. I'm just gonna kind of let this set for about 20 seconds. And after about 20 seconds, I'm gonna turn off the heat. Now I'm putting a colander, put my cheesecloth in the colander. And after that 20 seconds is up, I'm just gonna carefully pour off the whey. Now, what should be left is just the whey. The whey should be draining through, and the curds will be left in the cheesecloth. Now, this can take a little bit. I'm gonna kind of let this sit for about 5 minutes. Let as much go through, and you can kind of help it along a little bit by shaking the colander a little bit or moving the cheesecloth around a little bit. But you're gonna want to let this drain as much as possible. It's important to try to be as patient as you can here in this step. Now from here, I'm going to be holding up the corners of the cheesecloth, and I'm going to kind of just be putting it into a ball at the end, and I'm going to kind of help it along, squeeze it up a little bit, get as much of that whey out as I can, being careful not to press too hard because sometimes those cheese curds can come through. Now after I drained it a little bit, I'm going to reopen it up, and it's at this stage I'm going to sprinkle in my salt. So I have the teaspoon of sea salt adding in, and if you want to add in other herbs or some paprika or other seasonings, this would be the stage. Going back into the cheesecloth and continuing the draining process. And I'm just kind of giving it a little twist, a little squeeze, and just make sure I got as much of that way. And you can see I got all the solids out. From here at this point, now you can leave it in the cheesecloth and just hang the cheesecloth to let drain. I'm putting this into a cheese basket because I'll be using the cheesecloth for another cheese. But you can either keep it in there in the cheesecloth and hang it on top of the sink or something. But I'm putting it in a cheese mold and I'm gonna let this drain for about another hour to 2 hours, depending on the firmness that I'm looking for. Then I put it in the fridge for a couple hours and I'm ready to take it out of our mold. Careful not to break it. Broke this one up a little bit, but you can kind of really see. Now this is one of the easiest ones there is. It's heating the milk, adding the citric acid, draining, and pressing. That's basically it. And you can see I have this really nice, soft, crumbly cheese. Okay, now for goat cheese. I'm gonna show you two different types of goat cheese. And for both of these goat cheeses, I'm gonna be using the exact same ingredients for both. And this is gonna really kind of show you and explain that how you add the milk, what temperature you heat the milk to, when you heat the milk, when you add your citric acid, all plays a different role into the different types of cheese that you're gonna make. So this is really kind of interesting to me. The first one we're gonna be making is a soft and creamy goat cheese. Now for both of these recipes, I'll be using a half gallon of goat's milk. I'll have my colander, my thermometer, my pot. I'll be using this mold, but you can use the cheesecloth as well and just let it drain. Here I have 1 heaped teaspoon of citric acid and 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm gonna go ahead and put my citric acid into my 1/4 cup of room temperature water and just really make sure that that is really, really nice dissolved. Now again, both of these are going to be using the exact same ingredients. This first one is gonna be the soft and creamy goat cheese. Now for this one, I'm going to soft and creamy. I'm going to be adding in my goat's milk to this pot. And I'm going to immediately be adding in the citric acid while the milk's still cold. Adding it very slowly to this and just doing an up and down stirring motion. Being careful not to overstir, but to make sure that it is completely in there. From here, I'm going to be heating it up to 180 degrees, okay? After about 180 degrees, you gotta, again, be careful not to scorch the milk. You can stir it some, but 180 degrees, when the milk hits 180, I'm gonna take it off the heat, cover it, and I'm gonna let it sit for 30 minutes untouched. After 30 minutes untouched, as it's sitting there, the whey and the curds really separated kind of nicely. It looks really kind of milky, but you're gonna carefully pour this out. And it might not look like it's separated right away, but again, this is going to be a soft and creamy cheese. You'll be surprised what's left in this cheesecloth when we're done. Really going to just go ahead and really let this drain as much as we can. I'm going to let it drain for about 10 minutes as I'm kind of helping it by moving it around just a little bit. You can see once it's kind of drained there, I'm going to go ahead and add my salt into this one. And now you can add any seasonings you want. I decided just to add about a tablespoon of dried basil just to give this a little more flavor. And just going to go ahead and mix that in. Be careful not to really overstir it, but you know, you can mix it in nicely. Wrap it up into the cheesecloth and you're going to go ahead and in the ball and you're going to kind of help this along and really kind of squeeze out more of that whey. Now we want to be careful. I double layered our muslin here for this one, and you just kind of really kind of squeeze it from there. Once I got it completely drained, drained as much as I can, I'm going to go ahead and be carefully undoing this, and I'm going to be adding it to my mold. Now again, if you don't have a mold, you can just keep it in the cheesecloth and hang it over a pot or the kitchen sink, and the weight will eventually go from there. So here I have the cheese. I have it in my mold. I'm going to be putting it, you can already see it start to come out that way even more. I'm going to put it on top of a little bit of ramekin and I'm going to let this sit for an hour. After it's sat for an hour, you can see all that extra whey has been released with this. And I can continue to let this drain if I want to, but this is the right consistency that I'm looking for. and this comes out really nice. You have a really nice looking soft goat cheese. Very, very easy to do. Now for the crumbly one, like I mentioned, this is the exact same ingredients. So I'm starting with our half gallon of goat's milk. But for this one, I'm going to be heating this up to 190 degrees. So I'm going to be heating it up at a 10 degrees hotter than I did for the soft cheese. And I'm not adding my citric acid yet. Now, once the hits 190 degrees, now I'm going to add my citric acid, okay? So these are the two, this is the biggest difference in the steps that I'm doing here. So my milk's at 190 degrees, I added in my citric acid. Now I'm going to kind of turn this on low, and I'm just going to kind of cook this for about 30 seconds, occasionally stirring, but being careful not to over stir. After the 30 seconds is up, pulling it off the heat, and now I'm putting it into our cheesecloth and draining it with my colander, just the same as I did with my previous goat cheese. Now I'm using a double layer of cloth for this one, cheesecloth, because these goat cheeses can seep through after you're squeezing them a little bit. But just like that, just like the other one, I'm going to be kind of helping it, balling it up, and just giving it a slight squeeze and being very patient, trying to get all that excess whey. Now I got a lot of the whey out, and from here is when I'm going to be adding my salt, a teaspoon of salt. And again, you can add any other flavorings or additives at this stage if you want to add some seasonings and some fun stuff. But I just did the salt here, and now I am going to wrap up the muslin, and I'm gonna the cheesecloth, and I'm just gonna kind of put it down on the bottom of the colander, and I'm gonna be making a homemade press. So I put you can use a plate, you can use whatever you want to do. Adding some weight to that, I went with what I had on hand, pouch of our great cheese sauce, mucho queso cheese sauce, and I'm just going to let that wait, now that press, and I press that for about 2 hours. The longer the better. The longer you press, the firmer it's going to be. But you can see a lot of that excess whey came out. Now I can continue to press this. I can add more weight to it. The heavier the weight, the more pressure, like we mentioned earlier, the firmer the cheese is going to be. I just did this for a couple hours, and I'm just pulling this out. And you can see I kind of have a crumbly version of this here. Now I'm going to go ahead and mold this together, and you can mold this any way you want to do it. You don't have to mold it. In fact, like I said, you can let it dry even further. But I'm just going to put this in a little mold I have, kind of shape it up, make it look a little fancy, and then it just pulls right out. Now again, all these cheeses you can store for about five days, no problem. And again, if I would let this air dry a little bit, it's going to be firmer. If I would press it more, it would be firmer. So there's a lot of different things you can do with this. So here are the 4 cheeses. They're all fresh white cheeses. 3 of them using citric acid, 1 with the mozzarella using the rennet. And again, there is a lot of these are very easy to do, so don't be afraid and have some fun.